When I walked into the bathroom and suddenly saw my stepson there, I made a decision that transformed an ordinary moment into one of the most meaningful and memorable experiences of my life. It all began on a seemingly uneventful Tuesday evening. The house was tranquil, as it often was during this time of day. My stepson Liam had returned home earlier than usual, his car parked neatly in the driveway. At 21, Liam was no longer a boy, but a young man who carried himself with a quiet confidence. Yet, there was always a trace of hesitation in his interactions, a lingering shadow of self-doubt. After arriving home, I set down my briefcase and kicked off my heels, savoring the calm that enveloped the house. My partner, Patrick, Liam's father, was away on a business trip and wouldn't return until the next morning. The absence of his presence left the house feeling a little emptier, a little quieter. As I moved to grab a quick glass of water from the kitchen, I noticed the faint hum of running water from upstairs. Instinctively, I knew Liam was in the shower. It wasn't unusual, but there was something subtly different about the air. That evening, a sensation I couldn't quite shake. I told myself not to overthink it, and ascended the stairs, intending to head to my room. As I reached the landing, my eyes caught sight of the bathroom door slightly ajar. The sound of water was clearer now, a rhythmic backdrop to the otherwise silent house. I hesitated, curiosity tugging at me. A harmless glance, I thought, just to ensure everything was fine. Peering through the narrow gap, my breath caught in my throat. There stood Liam, his back to me, shirtless and slightly hunched over the sink. His movements were deliberate, as though absorbed in something I couldn't see. His jeans hung low on his hips, lending him a casual air that felt uncharacteristic of his usually reserved demeanor. Liam was meticulous about his privacy. An open door was almost unheard of. The scene was startling, not just for its rarity, but for the vulnerability it revealed. I lingered, torn between retreating and making my presence known. Before I could decide, the floor creaked softly beneath my shifting weight. Liam's head snapped up, and he spun around, his face a mask of surprise and panic. "Oh, I didn't know you. We're home," he stammered, quickly grabbing a towel to cover himself. His voice was shaky, his usual composure nowhere to be found. I didn't mean to intrude," I blurted out, averting my eyes as a flush of embarrassment warmed my cheeks. "I heard the water and thought something might be wrong." Liam's face turned crimson as he clutched the towel tighter. "No, it's nothing," he mumbled, though his voice trembled, betraying his unease. His eyes darted away from mine, and his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible burden. I hesitated, my hands still resting on the edge of the door. Part of me wanted to respect his privacy and retreat, but another part, stronger and more insistent, felt compelled to stay. "Liam," I said softly, stepping into the bathroom just enough to close the door behind me. "If something's wrong, you can tell me. I promise I won't judge." For a moment he froze. Then, with a shaky breath, he sat down on the edge of the bathtub, his grip on the towel loosening slightly. "It's kind of embarrassing," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned against the counter, keeping my posture relaxed to ease his discomfort. "You don't have to tell me if you're not comfortable," I assured him gently. "But sometimes it helps to talk about it." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor. "It's just, I've been dealing with something, and I didn't know who else to talk to." His vulnerability caught me off guard. Liam had always been so independent, so self-reliant. The fact that he was turning to me, someone he rarely confided in, felt profoundly significant. "What is it?" I asked, my tone gentle and encouraging. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's about my body," he said finally, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Something's not normal, and I don't know if it's something to worry about, or if I'm just overthinking." His confession carried a weight that spoke volumes about how long he'd been grappling with this alone. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. It must have taken tremendous courage to say even that much. "Well," I said carefully, "you're not alone. Everyone has questions like that at some point, and it's good that you're paying attention to your health. Do you want me to help? You figure it out." Liam glanced up at me, a mixture of relief and uncertainty in his expression. "You wouldn't mind?" "Of course not," I replied, offering him a reassuring smile. "We can handle this together." As we began to talk, the initial awkwardness melted away. Liam spoke in halting sentences, his words punctuated by nervous glances at the floor. I listened patiently, offering reassurance and practical advice where I could. What had started as an unexpected encounter became an opportunity for connection, a moment where walls were lowered and trust was built. By the time our conversation ended, the tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of mutual understanding. Liam's shoulders no longer carried the same invisible weight, and his eyes held a glimmer of relief. It wasn't just an ordinary Tuesday anymore. It was the day we bridged a gap, turning vulnerability into strength and discomfort into connection. I could, as Liam spoke, the weight of his concerns became increasingly clear. His voice trembled with every word, a sign of just how long he had kept these thoughts bottled up. The bathroom, warm and filled with the scent of soap, seemed like an unlikely setting for such a raw conversation, but in that moment it was the only place in the world that mattered. I guess I just don't know if it's normal," Liam said, fidgeting with the edge of the towel. "I mean, there's no manual for this stuff, right? And Dad, well, he's not exactly the person I'd want to ask." His words hung in the air, the unspoken truth behind them cutting through the awkwardness. Liam and Patrick had a good relationship, but there was always a layer of distance, a barrier neither of them seemed to know how to cross. "I get it," I said softly, leaning against the sink. "Sometimes it's hard to talk about things even with the people closest to you, but you're doing the right thing by bringing it up. It's better than keeping it all inside." He nodded, though his expression remained clouded. I don't want to seem weird or." "Liam," I interrupted gently, "everyone feels like that at some point. Trust me, you're not weird, you're brave for even bringing it up." His lips twitched into the faintest smile, and for a moment I thought the tension in his shoulders might ease, but it was clear that he still had more on his mind. "I've been feeling like I don't really know myself anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I don't fit in anywhere. And I don't know what's wrong with me." The vulnerability in his words hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about a physical concern. It was something deeper, something that had been gnawing at him for a long time. "Liam," I said after a moment of thought, "there's nothing wrong with you. You're figuring things out, and that's okay. Nobody has all the answers, especially not at your age." He glanced up at me, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "You really think so?" "I know so," I replied firmly. "And no matter what, I'm here to help you. We'll figure this out together." For the first time, Liam's posture relaxed ever so slightly. He leaned back against the wall, the towel still clutched in his hands, and let out a deep breath. "It's just I've never talked about this stuff before. I didn't think anyone would understand. Sometimes we don't give people enough credit," I said with a small smile. "You'd be surprised how understanding they can be if you give them a chance. But it's also so okay to be selective about who you open up to. Not everyone needs to know everything." He nodded again, this time with more confidence. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense." The conversation shifted, after that, moving away from the heavy weight of his initial concerns and toward more practical matters. I offered what advice I could, drawing from my own experiences and knowledge. I kept my tone light, careful not to make him feel judged or uncomfortable. As we talked, I noticed a change in Liam. The guardedness that usually surrounded him seemed to fade, replaced by a tentative openness. It was as if he was finally allowing himself to be seen, not just by me, but by himself as well. Throughout the conversation, I saw his tool growing. When he looked at me, which was normal of course, as I am a woman, but I can't deny it kind of excited me, as it was really big. I helped washing it, and sometimes held it because I needed to, but at those moments I would exactly rather hold it, make it go up and down. And even, I don't know what I was thinking, but I knew this wasn't my last time holding it. After what felt like hours, the conversation began to wind down. The tension that had filled the bathroom earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. Liam looked at me, his expression a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thanks," he said softly. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to talk about this with anyone." I smiled, reaching out to gently pat his shoulder. "I'm glad you did, and remember, you can always come to me if you need to talk about anything, no matter what. I'm here for you." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll remember that. As I stood to leave the bathroom, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved that Liam had opened up to me, and that I had been able to help him. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that there was more to his struggles than he was letting on. The evening passed Quietly after that, Liam retreated to his room, and I found myself sitting alone in the living room, a cup of tea in my hands. As I replayed the conversation in my mind, it was rare for Liam to open up to anyone, and the fact that he had chosen me felt significant. But it also left me with a lingering sense of unease. What if there were more things he was struggling with? And what if I wasn't equipped to help him? The question swirled in my mind as the hours ticked by. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, though. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on me. But even as doubts crept into my mind, one thing was certain: I would do everything in my power to be there for Liam, no matter what. Little did I know the events of that evening were just the beginning. The next few days unfolded with a strange, almost tangible tension that lingered in the air. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Liam was still going about his routine, working part-time at a local cafe, spending time in his room, and avoiding the heavier topics we had touched upon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite define, but could certainly feel. I tried to act as though everything was fine. After all, Liam had opened up to me, and I had done my best to reassure him that things would be okay. But there were moments, little things, that kept catching my attention. I'd see him retreat into himself, his eyes avoiding mine when we passed in the hallway, or the way his shoulders would tense whenever I tried to make small talk. It was as if he was retreating into a world that I couldn't access. One he hadn't let me in on. At dinner one evening, as we sat at the table in silence, I caught him looking at me out of the corner of his eye. Our gazes met for a fraction of a second before he quickly looked away, his cheeks flushing. It was a fleeting moment, but it left me with a strange, unsettled feeling, like there was something unspoken hanging between us. I tried to brush it off, but it wasn't easy. The connection we had, whatever it was, seemed to be shifting into something undefined, something I wasn't sure I understood. Patrick came home that night, his usual cheerful self, and we settled into our nightly routine. But even with his presence, something still felt off. Liam was quieter than usual, and I couldn't help but notice how his eyes would drift toward me during the evening, only to quickly look away when I caught him. It was subtle, but it was there. The next day, when Patrick had gone to work, I found myself alone in the house with Liam. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his posture hesitant. "Hey," I greeted him, trying to keep my tone light. "Everything okay?" He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I just wanted to talk." A small knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. This was at this moment that had been hanging in the air between us for days. I set down the knife I had been using and turned to face him fully. "What's on your mind, Liam?" I asked, my voice calm despite the nervous fluttering in my chest. He hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other, as if debating whether to speak or not. "I have been feeling kind of strange lately." He began, his words slow and measured, as if choosing them carefully. "I don't really know how to explain it, but something's been bothering me, something I can't quite put my finger on." I gave him my full attention, watching as his eyes drifted to the floor, avoiding mine. "You know you can talk to me, right?" I said softly. "If something's bothering you, I'm here." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a long, drawn-out breath, as if bracing himself for whatever was coming. "I just don't know what's happening to me," he said finally, his voice thick with uncertainty. My heart ached for him. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the same uncertainty that had clouded his expression the first time we talked. The Liam standing in front of me now was different from the one I had known for a while now. That there was a weight on him, an invisible burden he seemed unsure how to carry. It was written in the way he moved, the hesitation in his words, and the quiet sighs he thought no one noticed. "It's okay," I said gently, walking over to him and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to know everything right away. Sometimes we don't have all the answers, but that's okay. We can figure it out together." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something raw I couldn't quite place. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing the real Liam. Not the guarded version he showed the world, but the person beneath. "I've been feeling lost," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Like I don't know who I am anymore or where I fit in. I know I'm not a kid anymore, but sometimes it feels like I don't know how to grow up. Like I'm stuck." The honesty of his confession hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about growing pains or awkward transitions, this was deeper. Liam was grappling with something emotional, something that reached into the very core of who he was becoming. I think a lot of people feel that way, Liam, I said softly, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. It's not easy to figure everything out all at once, but you don't have to do it alone. You've got me, and you've got your dad. We're here for you. He met my gaze, his expression softening, though a flicker of uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. I know, he murmured. I just don't want to burden anyone with my problems. You're not a burden, I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for doubt. You never will be. We're family, and when things get tough, we stick together. He nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small, tentative smile. My words seemed to give him a measure of comfort, and for the rest of the afternoon, Liam seemed more at ease. He stayed in the kitchen, helping me with the dishes and chatting about trivial things, his usual reserve replaced by a newfound openness. For the first time in days, he felt like the Liam I had known, less guarded, a little more at ease. But even as he laughed and smiled, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling me. The weight in his eyes hadn't fully lifted, and I knew this conversation, though significant, was just the beginning. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts were filled with everything Liam had said, and everything he hadn't. He had opened up to me more than he had in years, and yet I felt like I was only scratching the surface. There was a part of him I hadn't reached yet, a part he wasn't ready to share. But one thing was clear. I was committed to helping him, no matter how long it took or how difficult the journey became. This wasn't just about helping him navigate the awkwardness of growing up. It was about helping him find his way, his sense of self, in a world that often felt overwhelming. The days that followed our conversation felt like walking a tightrope. Liam had been more open, and I could see glimpses of relief in him, as though a weight had been lifted. But there was still a hesitancy, a shadow of something unspoken. It lingered between us, an invisible thread pulling at the edges of our bond. One evening, about a week later, Liam seemed more distant than usual. At dinner, he barely spoke, offering only short, detached responses to my questions. I glanced at him several times, trying to gauge his mood, but his gaze was elsewhere, his thoughts seemingly a million miles away. After dinner, as Patrick retreated to the living room to watch TV, I stayed behind in the kitchen, busying myself with the dishes. The quiet hum of the water filled the space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw Liam standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes usually full of hesitation, were darker now, clouded with an emotion I couldn't place. My heart skipped a beat. Liam, I said gently, turning toward him. What's wrong? For a moment, he just stood there, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. Then finally he stepped into the room, his hands fidgeting nervously. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice trembling ever so slightly. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. I'm listening, I said, my tone steady and full of reassurance. And as he began to speak, I braced myself for what was to come. Whatever it was, I knew we would face it together, because that's what family does. I turned to face him, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Liam, I asked softly, trying to keep my tone neutral, though the concern in my voice was hard to hide. Is everything okay? He nodded but didn't move to enter the room. There was a long silence as we stood there, and I could feel the weight of his emotions hanging between us like an unspoken truth waiting to be revealed. I've been thinking about our conversation, Liam said, his voice low, almost hesitant, and about what you said about being here for me. He paused, then took a step closer, his face tense, as if he were bracing himself. I think I need to talk to you about something else. Something I haven't been able to figure out. My pulse quickened at his words. I stepped forward, my heart heavy with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Of course, Liam, I said, my voice steady but laced with warmth. Whatever it is, we'll talk through it. You don't have to carry it alone. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I had come to associate with moments of vulnerability. It's not easy for me to say this, he began, his voice shaking slightly. But I need to tell you something. It's been eating at me for a while now, and I don't know who else to turn to. I stood still, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it was, I could sense it was significant. I didn't want to push him, but I wanted to be there for him. So I simply nodded, encouraging him to go on. He paused, his eyes flickering toward the floor before meeting mine again. I don't know how to explain this, but I've been feeling different about you. The words hung in the air, so heavy and unexpected that they took me by surprise. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. Different, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart racing. What do you mean, Liam? He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. I've been feeling confused, he said. I've been questioning a lot of things about myself, and I think I might have feelings for you. The confession left me frozen in place. I stared at him, unsure of how to react. His words blurred in my mind as I tried to process what he was saying. My heart raced, and my mind was in overdrive, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't what I had prepared for when I had promised to be there for him. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw the raw honesty and desperation. Liam wasn't asking for anything. He was just trying to make sense of what he felt. And in that moment, I realized that he needed someone who would listen without judgment, without fear. I took a slow, steady breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. Liam, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. I'm so glad that you came to me. But I need you to know something. I paused, searching for the right words. You're not messed up. You're just going through something that's confusing. And it's okay to feel lost sometimes. But I need you to understand that what we're talking about, it's complicated. This situation is complicated. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. I know, he said. I didn't know who else to talk to. And I didn't want to carry this anymore. His voice cracked slightly, and I could see the vulnerability in him. This wasn't about desire. This was about confusion, about finding a safe space in a world that had suddenly become overwhelming. I took a step toward him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Liam, I said, my voice steady but full of empathy. I will always be here for you. But this situation is something that requires careful thought. What you're feeling, it's okay. But we need to navigate this slowly. I can't give you what you want in the way you might be hoping for right now. And I don't want to lead you down a path that could hurt both of us. He looked at me, his lips trembling, as if waiting for me to pull away or tell him to leave. But I didn't. I just stood there, trying to offer him comfort in the only way I knew how. I'll always be someone you can talk to, I said gently. But we need to figure out what this means without rushing into anything. He nodded again, his shoulders relaxing slightly as if a weight had been lifted. But in the silence that followed, something shifted within me. I couldn't deny the way my heart had raced, the way his words had stirred something deep inside me. Was it curiosity? Was it something more? I hesitated, caught between my instincts and my reason. Then, as if some unseen force had taken over, I reached up and placed my hands on his shoulders. My gaze met his, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to disappear. Slowly, I leaned in and kissed him. It was tentative at first, a question more than a declaration. But when he kissed me back, it was as if a dam had broken. The tension, the confusion, the unspoken emotions, they all came rushing to the surface. I pulled away briefly, my breath unsteady. Liam, I whispered, searching his eyes for any hint of regret. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. This is amazing. And in that moment I let go of my doubts and fears, allowing myself to feel, to be present. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, we would face it together, one step at a time. I did something I'd been wanting to do, for what felt like forever. Ever since that moment in the bathroom, when I looked up and saw him, the way he seemed to enjoy it. This is amazing, he mumbled, his voice barely audible, but filled with something raw and genuine. Time slipped away, and after what felt like 10 minutes, I noticed he was nearing his end. I moved faster, feeling his tension build until it finally happened. For a long while afterward, neither of us said a word. Silence wrapped around us, heavy yet somehow comforting. The weight of his unspoken words hung in the air, as though they were trying to find their place. Slowly, Liam exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for far too long, his shoulders relaxing under its release. "Thank you," he whispered. "I needed that." "You're welcome," I said softly, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest, a tangle of emotions I couldn't fully unravel. "And remember, you don't have to figure everything out at once. You're not alone in this." Liam nodded after a beat, his expression lightening just enough to reveal a faint, fleeting smile. "I'm going to head upstairs," he said quietly. "Thanks again. I think I'll sleep better tonight." "Good night, Liam," I replied, watching him disappear up the stairs. There was a slight lift in his posture, as though a small piece of his burden had been eased. Yet, as I stood there in the kitchen, alone once again, a sense of change lingered in the air. That moment had been pivotal, a turning point in our relationship. Whether it would lead to healing or something more complicated, I couldn't yet say. The following days passed in a strange, muted stillness. There was a shift in the atmosphere at home, subtle but undeniable. Liam had become more withdrawn again, but not in the same way as before. This wasn't the kind of distance that felt cold or hostile. Instead, it was as though he was deep in thought, wrestling with something internal, trying to process everything we had talked about. I'd catch him sometimes, sitting quietly lost in his own world. His eyes would drift to some faraway point, his fingers tracing absent-minded patterns on the rim of his coffee cup, or the fabric of his jeans. I didn't want to push him. I knew this was something he needed to work through on his own terms, in his own time. But it was hard. Every part of me wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of reassurance, to remind him that he didn't have to carry his weight alone. One afternoon, I was in the living room when I caught a glimpse of Liam walking past the hallway. His shoulders were hunched, his head down, and there was a heaviness to his steps that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to stir something inside me. Without thinking, I stood up and followed him. "Liam," I called softly as I approached. "Can we talk for a moment?" He stopped, turning to look at me with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. For a moment, I thought he might retreat upstairs, shutting himself off like before. But then slowly he nodded. We walked into the living room together, and he sank onto the couch. His posture was guarded, his eyes a mix of apprehension and quiet hope. "It's been a little while since we talked," I began, keeping my tone gentle as I settled into the seat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "But I can tell there's still something on your mind. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I just want you to know that I'm here." For a long moment, Liam didn't respond. His gaze was fixed ahead, his jaw tight. Then finally he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging just slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about us being family," he said, his voice quiet, almost unsure. "And I keep wondering if I'm just overthinking everything. I don't know how to stop feeling like this." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Like I'm trapped in my own head, and everything I feel is wrong." His frustration was palpable, etched into every word, every movement. Liam had always been someone who kept his emotions locked away, as though burying them deep enough would make them disappear. But I knew better. Emotions don't just vanish. They linger, growing heavier until they demand to be acknowledged. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I said softly. "What you're feeling is real, and it's okay to feel confused, to feel lost. It doesn't mean you're broken or wrong. It just means you're human." His eyes flicked toward me, uncertainty still lingering in their depths. But there was something else too, a fragile kind of trust. "I just don't want to make things weird," he admitted, his voice tight with discomfort. "I don't want to cross any lines or feel like I'm too much. But I don't know who else to talk to." My heart ached for him. I could see how hard he was trying to make sense of himself, to reconcile the feelings that seemed to pull him in every direction. And in that moment, I realized that he wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for validation, for someone to tell him that his feelings weren't something to be ashamed of. "Liam," I said, my voice steady, "you're not crossing any lines. You're not too much. You're just someone trying to figure things out, and that's completely normal. What you feel doesn't make you bad or wrong. It just makes you you." He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together as he processed my words. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever stop feeling like this, like I'll ever really know who I am. It's okay not to have everything figured out, I said, leaning forward slightly to make sure he knew I was fully present. This is a process, Liam. It doesn't happen overnight, but you'll get there, and you don't have to do it alone. For a long time, we sat in silence. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, a kind of healing that didn't need words. You make me feel like I'm not crazy, he finally said, his voice breaking the stillness. Like what I'm feeling isn't something to be ashamed of. You're not crazy, I said softly, offering a small, genuine smile. And you're never alone in this. I'm here, Liam. Always.